Before you scroll, take a breath with me. Right now, something inside you brought you here. Welcome to Therapist Live. This is more than a channel. It's a space for clarity, healing, and real emotional growth. Here, we talk about mental health, self-awareness, relationships, and the patterns that shape your life. If you're ready to understand yourself on a deeper level, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this journey starts today. Take a deep breath, and let's begin. Imagine you are standing on a dusty railroad construction site in Vermont. The year is 1848. A young, highly capable foreman named Phineas Gage is packing explosive powder into a rock crevice using a 3.5-foot-long iron rod. Suddenly, the charge accidentally detonates. The massive iron rod rockets upward like a spear, entering just below his left cheek, blowing completely through the front of his brain, and landing dozens of feet away. You would expect this to be a fatal blow, but astonishingly, Phineas doesn't die. In fact, within minutes, he is awake, talking, and perfectly capable of walking with a little help. His speech is fine, his memory is intact, and his intelligence seems entirely unaffected. But the man who survived that explosion was no longer Phineas Gage. The dependable, polite, and hard-working foreman was gone, replaced by a man who was shockingly profane, impulsive, and entirely unreliable. His personality had been literally blown away by the iron rod. This tragic event is one of the most famous and foundational stories in all of neuroscience. Why? Because it proved something revolutionary. Our personality, our morality, and our ability to make sound decisions are not mystical forces floating in the ether. They are anchored to specific physical structures inside the brain. When you change the physical architecture of the brain, you fundamentally change the person. Welcome back to our journey through the human mind, based on the monumental insights from the book Brain and Behavior. In our first episode, we zoomed all the way in to look at the microscopic sparks and chemical whispers of individual neurons. Now we're going to zoom out. We are going to look at the grand architecture of the nervous system. We will explore how billions of tiny, blind cells somehow wire themselves together to construct your reality, and what happens when that majestic biological machinery breaks down. When you look at a human brain, the first thing you notice is its deeply wrinkled surface. It looks a bit like an oversized, grayish-pink walnut. But have you ever stopped to wonder why it is wrinkled? To answer that, we have to look at a rare condition called Lissencephaly, which literally translates to smooth brain. There are documented cases of people, like a woman named Karen, whose brains lack these characteristic folds. While Karen defied the odds by graduating from college and living a relatively normal life, most people born with this condition suffer from severe intellectual impairments and debilitating seizures. The wrinkles are an evolutionary masterpiece of packaging. They allow an enormous amount of surface area, the cerebral cortex, where our highest level processing occurs, to be crumpled and stuffed into the relatively small, confined space of the human skull. If you were to unfold and iron out the cerebral cortex, it would be roughly the size of a large pizza. This outer layer of bark is divided into 4 distinct territories, or lobes, each managing a different portfolio of your life. Let's take a quick tour. At the very front, right behind your forehead, sit the frontal lobes. This is the executive boardroom of the brain. It is responsible for complex movement, language production, and the highest of human functions: impulse control, long-term planning, and moral reasoning. This is exactly the area that was destroyed in Phineas Gage. Without it, you are entirely at the mercy of your immediate urges. Moving toward the top and back, we find the parietal lobes, which process sensory information from your body. They tell you where your limbs are in space, allow you to feel a gentle touch, and help you navigate your physical environment. At the very back of the skull are the occipital lobes, a massive processing center devoted entirely to making sense of the light entering your eyes. Finally, sweeping along the sides near your ears are the temporal lobes. These areas are critical for hearing and understanding language, but they also perform incredibly complex visual tasks, like recognizing the faces of your loved ones. When a specific part of the temporal lobe is damaged, a person might retain their vision and their intellect, but lose the ability to visually recognize objects. The famous neurologist Oliver Sacks once wrote about a brilliant music professor with this exact type of damage. The man was perfectly articulate, yet he would affectionately pat the tops of parking meters, genuinely believing they were children, and he was baffled when the carved wooden knobs on his furniture didn't politely return his greetings. Now, here is a fascinating rhetorical question. If you drew a line straight down the middle of your head, splitting this architecture in two, would you have two separate minds? The brain is divided into a left and a right hemisphere, separated by a deep fissure. They are almost mirror images of each other, but they don't operate in isolation. They are constantly whispering to one another across a massive, dense bridge of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. But in some severe cases of epilepsy, surgeons must literally cut this bridge to stop electrical storms from sweeping across the entire brain. When this happens, the patient becomes a split-brain individual. The results of this surgery are profoundly bizarre. The left hemisphere generally controls the right side of the body and houses our language centers, while the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body and is highly skilled at spatial reasoning. In a split-brain patient, these two halves can no longer communicate. In rare, startling moments, the two hands might literally fight each other. A patient might find their right hand pulling up their trousers, while their left hand aggressively tries to pull them back down. One patient's left hand, controlled by the emotional right hemisphere, actually tried to strike his wife, while his right hand frantically reached over to restrain it. It is an eerie, staggering demonstration that when you disconnect the architecture of the brain, you divide the very essence of human intention. Later in this series, I will explain what this means for the great mystery of human consciousness. But first, we need to understand how this staggering architecture builds itself in the first place. How does a microscopic, single fertilized egg grow into a complex network of 86 billion neurons, all perfectly wired together? The development of the nervous system is the most breathtaking construction project in the known universe. It begins just weeks after conception. The outer layer of the embryo folds in on itself, curling into a tiny, hollow neural tube. From this simple tube, the entire brain and spinal cord will emerge. The construction happens in 4 major stages. The first is proliferation. Deep inside the core of the developing brain, new cells are born at a staggering, almost incomprehensible rate of 250,000 every single minute. Once these baby neurons are born, they must travel to their final destinations to form the outer layers of the brain. This is the second stage, migration. But how do they know where to go? They literally crawl along specialized, rope-like cells called radial glia, sliding upward like construction workers, climbing scaffolding on a skyscraper. If this migration stops too early, the brain fails to form its necessary folds, resulting in the smooth brain condition we discussed earlier. Once the neurons reach their designated spots, they have to wire themselves together. This is the third stage, circuit formation. The neurons sprout long cables, called axons. At the tip of each growing axon is a structure called a growth cone, which acts like a biological bloodhound. It sniffs out chemical attractants and avoids chemical repellents, pushing and pulling its way through the dense jungle of the developing brain until it finds its precise target. The final stage of brain development might surprise you. You might think that becoming smarter and more mature means growing more brain cells, but actually it is the exact opposite. The final stage is circuit pruning. The brain initially overproduces neurons and synapses. To create an efficient, lightning-fast system, it has to aggressively trim away the dead wood. Neurons that fail to make strong connections simply die off in a process of programmed cell death. It is a brutal biological truth. In the brain, it is strictly use it or lose it. As we grow and learn, we are literally sculpting our brains by eliminating the pathways we don't need. This ability of the brain to physically reshape itself based on experience is called neuroplasticity. It continues throughout our entire lives. But if the brain is so adaptable, why are severe injuries to the nervous system so utterly devastating? If you fall off a skateboard and sever a nerve in your arm, you might lose feeling for a while, but eventually, the nerve can slowly grow back, using its original casing as a guide tube. This happens in the peripheral nervous system, but if you fall and sever your spinal cord, the damage is almost always permanent, leading to lifelong paralysis. Why is the central nervous system seemingly incapable of this kind of repair? The answer is a cruel twist of evolutionary fate. In adult mammals, the central nervous system is a hostile environment for healing. When the brain or spinal cord is damaged, specialized glial cells rush to the scene and form a thick scar tissue that physically blocks regenerating cables from growing past the injury. Worse still, the surrounding tissue releases a cocktail of chemical inhibitors, most notably a protein ironically named no-go-away, that actively repels and shuts down any attempts at new growth. For decades, the great neuroscientist Aniago Ramon Wycahal's gloomy decree that the central nervous system could never regenerate was considered absolute biological law. But modern science is finally beginning to crack the code. Take the story of Christopher Reeve, the actor famous for playing Superman. Following a tragic horseback riding accident that shattered his upper spinal cord, he was left completely paralyzed from the neck down. Most experts believed he would never move again, but Reeve subjected himself to grueling, cutting-edge therapies involving intensive electrical stimulation of his muscles. Years later, he managed to regain some sensation and movement, moving from a completely hopeless classification to one showing measurable neural recovery. Today, scientists are testing extraordinary interventions. They are using drugs to block the no-go-away protein, essentially cutting the brakes on neural regeneration. They are experimenting with stem cells, coaxing them to patch the gaps in shattered spinal cords, and they are developing brain-computer interfaces, where paralyzed patients can bypass their damaged spines entirely, using their raw brainwaves to control robotic arms to feed themselves. We are standing on the precipice of an era where the word impossible may finally be erased from the vocabulary of neuroscience. We have explored the grand physical architecture of the brain. We have seen how it builds itself from a hollow tube into a complex metropolis, and how we are fighting to repair it when it breaks. But the physical brain is just the hardware. How does this dark, silent, squishy organ actually generate the vibrant, colorful, noisy world that you and I experience every second of our waking lives? In the next video, we are going to dive into the astonishing world of sensation and perception. We will discover how your eyes and ears don't just record reality, but actively hallucinate it. We will learn why you might be seeing colors that don't physically exist, and how the magical invention of language allows us to literally plant thoughts into each other's heads. You won't want to miss it. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the human mind, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. If you had to lose one part of your brain's architecture, which would it be and why? Share this series with someone who is fascinated by human nature. And I will see you in video 3.